They used to stand behind pulpits with a kind of certainty that felt unshakable. Faces calm, voices steady, words wrapped in conviction. But something is shifting quietly across churches, towns, and denominations. Pastors, the supposed anchors of belief, are walking away, and not just a few. It's happening at a scale no one expected. The numbers tell a sobering story. Surveys from Barna, Lifeway, and other church research groups reveal that a growing percentage of pastors are considering leaving ministry altogether. Burnout, disillusionment, financial strain, moral fatigue, all piling up faster than faith can patch over. Many who once saw the pulpit as a lifelong calling now see it as an emotional trap they can't keep enduring. But the deeper question isn't how they're leaving, it's why. What's pushing people who once believed they were chosen to lead others to suddenly walk away from the very thing that once defined them? Some of it starts with pressure constant, suffocating pressure. Pastors are expected to be spiritual doctors, emotional counselors, financial managers, event planners, and sometimes even entertainers. They lead communities that expect endless optimism, perfect marriages, flawless children, and unwavering faith. In a world that constantly changes, they're asked to stay the same, morally pure, emotionally strong, and theologically certain. But certainty is fragile, and the moment cracks appear, it's not just their job that's at risk, it's their identity. When faith becomes a profession, doubt becomes a liability. Pastors live under an invisible surveillance system. Every sermon is recorded, every post dissected, every opinion potentially career-ending. The church environment, especially in modern evangelical circles, often rewards image more than honesty. The person behind the pulpit has to pretend the answers still work, even when, privately, they know they don't. There's also the growing gap between belief and reality. The moral stories that once made sense in sermons don't match the complexity of modern life anymore. People have more access to information psychology, philosophy, science, and many of the ancient explanations no longer satisfy. Pastors, who once mediated between the sacred and the secular, now find themselves caught between two worlds. One where faith insists on certainty, and another where reality demands evidence. Many of them confess anonymously, quietly, in online forums that they've stopped believing. Not overnight, but gradually. Like a light dimming over years of unanswered questions and unseen hypocrisy. Some stay in ministry because they don't know what else to do. Their degrees, their friendships, their identity all tied to belief. Leaving feels like walking off a cliff into a life with no structure, no community, and no purpose. The irony is that the system they serve doesn't allow honest doubt, even though doubt is exactly what most of them are drowning in. When a scientist questions, it's called progress. When a pastor questions, it's called sin. There's also a silent economic truth behind all of this. Most pastors are underpaid and overworked. Many lead small congregations that can barely cover expenses. Their work weeks often stretch to 60 or 70 hours. Funerals, counseling, visits, meetings, sermon prep, conflict resolution, all while being told their reward is in heaven. The emotional labor never ends, and the paycheck rarely grows. Some have to pick up side jobs just to stay afloat, while still being expected to embody spiritual abundance. But exhaustion alone doesn't explain the mass exit. There's something deeper, a collapse of meaning. The moral framework that religion offers used to hold societies together, at least superficially, but when that framework starts to crack under its own contradictions, when doctrines collide with empathy, when dogma clashes with reality, those who teach it feel the break first. Pastors stand at the intersection of idealism and reality. Every week, they tell stories about forgiveness while watching their own churches tear each other apart over politics and identity. They preach love while seeing prejudice justified through the same scriptures they quote. They tell people to trust God while secretly struggling with depression, anxiety, and emptiness. It's not that these people are weak. It's that the system demands a kind of superhuman consistency no one can sustain. When belief is treated as performance, burnout is inevitable. Many of the pastors leaving today describe their departure not as rebellion, but as relief. Relief from pretending. Relief from holding together a worldview that keeps crumbling under scrutiny. Relief from carrying other people's faith when their own has quietly died. For some, the breaking point comes from hypocrisy, not just in others, but in themselves. How long can someone preach about sin and salvation when they no longer know what those words mean? How long can they lead a community that condemns questions as threats? As churches become more polarized politically, theologically, culturally, the pastor becomes the lightning rod for everyone's frustration. Congregations want answers for everything, from social issues to pandemics, and pastors are expected to provide divine clarity on demand. But, in reality, they're just as uncertain as anyone else. Maybe more so, because they see how the institution works behind the curtain. Behind every sermon about hope, there's often a man or woman silently wondering why they feel none of it themselves. And that's where the exodus begins, not with a scandal or a crisis, but with a quiet thought. What if it's all just not true? When that thought lands, it doesn't go away. It lingers. It eats through years of conviction, reshaping everything they believed about morality, purpose, even self-worth. Because if the foundation was built on divine certainty, and that certainty cracks, the entire structure shakes. Churches rarely talk about it, but entire online communities now exist for former pastors who've left the faith. Groups like the Clergy Project give them a place to say what they could never say in public, that they no longer believe in God, but still carry the trauma of pretending they did for years. They talk about depression, guilt, and loss, not of faith, but of identity. When someone's entire life is defined by the idea of divine purpose, losing it feels like a kind of death, but also a kind of rebirth. They step into a world that doesn't revolve around belief, and for the first time, they can breathe without having to defend their doubts. Some describe it as stepping out of a play they'd been performing since childhood, a script written long before they were born, and once they stop reciting it, the silence feels both terrifying and honest. Leaving ministry often means losing everything that once gave life a sense of direction, not just income, but belonging. Pastors don't just quit a job, they lose an entire ecosystem built around obedience and affirmation. Their friends, mentors, and sometimes even their families see departure not as burnout, but as betrayal. That social cost keeps many pastors trapped for years, pretending to believe. They become actors in their own sermons, mouthing words they can't feel anymore. They keep the tone, the rhythm, the certainty. But inside, something's gone quiet. They still preach about eternal life, but their eyes have seen how religion feeds on guilt and control. They've seen how the promise of heaven keeps people docile, how fear of hell keeps them obedient. And once you see that clearly, it's hard to keep calling it truth. It's also hard to keep believing in divine guidance when you've sat through hundreds of counseling sessions with families destroyed by the very faith you teach. Pastors see things most believers never do: the despair of people who prayed for healing and got silence, the guilt of those who think every misfortune is punishment, the pain of those who try to reconcile love, with doctrines that condemn who they are. And then they're told to explain it all away, to justify suffering as God's plan. Some do, for a while, but the ones leaving now say they reached a point where those words started to taste false. How do you comfort a grieving mother by saying her child's death serves a divine purpose, when deep down you know it doesn't? This moral dissonance between compassion and doctrine is at the core of the crisis. For centuries, faith provided moral frameworks, but it also demanded moral blindness. The moment a pastor starts choosing empathy over dogma, they begin drifting from the institution itself, because the institution thrives on obedience, not empathy. The church often presents itself as a family, but it behaves more like a company, one that measures loyalty in silence and faith in compliance. Question the teachings, and you risk exile. Ask where the money goes, and suddenly you're not trusting God enough. For many pastors, this contradiction becomes unbearable. They entered ministry believing they were serving truth, but they discover they're maintaining an illusion, an organization dependent on perpetual belief. They see tithes funding luxurious buildings, while local poverty grows. They see leaders who preach humility from pulpits, but live with wealth and privilege. They see the machinery of religion turning spiritual longing into a market, and in that machinery, they see themselves part of the sales force. For a while, they justify it. They tell themselves that good intentions outweigh institutional flaws. But when the sermons start to sound like sales pitches, when the language of love starts to sound like manipulation, the illusion breaks. There's also the pressure of constant performance. In any normal job, you're allowed bad days, uncertainty, doubt. But for a pastor, every weakness becomes a spiritual failure. If you admit to depression, you're told to pray harder. If you question Scripture, you're warned about spiritual warfare. Every human emotion is filtered through the lens of sin or salvation. There's no space for being human, only for being holy. That's not sustainable. Modern life has also accelerated the unraveling. The internet exposed people to new ideas, scientific evidence, and secular morality that doesn't rely on divine reward or punishment. When church members start asking tougher questions, pastors can't rely on old answers. You can't say God's ways are mysterious to someone who's read evolutionary, biology, cosmology, or neuroscience. The distance between ancient texts and modern understanding keeps widening, and the pastors standing in the middle are running out of bridges. You can hear it in the way some sermons have changed more politics, less theology. When spiritual authority fades, many try to replace it with ideological certainty. That's why so many pulpits sound more like campaign rallies now. The sacred becomes partisan because power is easier to sell than mystery. But for pastors who entered ministry to help people, not to serve ideology, this transformation feels like betrayal. Many of them say they didn't quit faith. Faith quit them. It stopped answering. It stopped being coherent. They started noticing that prayer outcomes were indistinguishable from chance, that miracles only happened in emotionally charged environments, never in hospitals with proper documentation, that the people who claimed divine guidance made decisions no more moral than anyone else. And once you notice that, you can't unsee it. Some of the most honest accounts from ex-pastors describe an internal war wanting faith to be true, but being unable to force belief back into existence. They talk about the loneliness of preaching words that no longer hold power, of singing songs that feel hollow, of smiling through the slow decay of meaning. One described it as death by honesty. The moment he stopped lying to himself, everything collapsed. His marriage, his community, his income, all tied to a belief system that couldn't survive scrutiny. But he also said it was the first time he felt free from pretending to know what no one actually knows. The cost of that freedom is enormous. Former pastors often speak about the grief of losing community. Belief is more than an idea, it's a network, a rhythm, a belonging. Leaving it feels like tearing yourself out of a shared dream. But some say that once they're out, they begin to see the dream for what it was: comforting, yes, but confining. And then they discover something surprising. Life outside belief doesn't collapse. Morality doesn't vanish. Purpose doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. They start to build meaning from reality instead of revelation. They start to notice that the sky doesn't fall without prayer, that kindness still matters, even without commandments, that empathy doesn't require divine permission. For many former pastors, this realization is both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it exposes how much of their life was built around illusions, but liberating because it proves that goodness doesn't depend on belief. What they begin to see is that morality, real morality, isn't about obedience to an invisible authority. It's about understanding consequences, compassion, and connection. The idea that people can't be good without God starts to crumble once they experience genuine decency outside the church walls. They see people living honest, ethical, and purposeful lives without the weight of doctrine or guilt. And that forces a question they can't unask. If morality survives without religion, what exactly was religion for? The deeper they look, the clearer it becomes that religion's strength isn't in its truth, but in its structure. It offers belonging, certainty, and identity, all things the human brain craves. But it also demands submission. The system works only if people stop questioning it. And pastors, once trained to maintain that system, find themselves slowly strangled by it. They realize that their entire education was designed not to explore truth, but to defend a pre-approved narrative. Theology, for all its sophistication, is often just a maze built around circular reasoning, starting with the conclusion that God exists and working backward to justify it. And once you see the loop, it's impossible to unsee. That's why so many pastors describe a strange moment of clarity before they finally quit a single, quiet instant when everything falls apart. For some, it happens while reading the Bible, noticing contradictions they'd always brushed aside. For others, it's watching a tragedy unfold, realizing that faith offers no comfort beyond words. And for a few, it's just silence praying and feeling nothing but their own voice echoing back. Once the illusion breaks, there's no going back. But leaving the ministry doesn't instantly heal the damage. Many carry deep psychological scars, guilt from years of telling people that doubt was dangerous, shame from realizing they once enforced fear they no longer believe in. They wrestle with the fact that they taught others certainty they no longer possess. They feel complicit in a system that demanded conformity at the expense of truth. Some turn that guilt into activism, helping others question without shame. Others simply disappear, finding peace in anonymity. But almost all of them describe a similar journey, a slow movement from fear to freedom. Freedom, however, comes with a price. Without the ready-made structure of religion, meaning has to be built, not received. There's no divine plan, no heavenly safety net, just the raw uncertainty of being human. For many, that's terrifying, but it's also honest. The kind of honesty they never found behind the pulpit. And in that honesty, they start discovering something deeper, not spiritual, but profoundly human. The ability to create meaning rather than inherit it, to build morality from empathy instead of decree, to live without pretending that someone else is in control. In the broader sense, the mass resignation of pastors is a symptom of a larger cultural shift. The world is slowly moving away from inherited authority, from kings, from priests, from old texts that once dictated truth. Knowledge has become democratized. People no longer need a mediator between themselves and understanding. And for an institution built on mediation, that's an existential threat. When information was scarce, pastors held power because they were interpreters of mystery. But now, mystery is shrinking. Neuroscience explains what used to be called the soul. Cosmology explains what was once creation. Ethics evolves without divine commandments. The more people learn, the less they need faith to fill the gaps. Pastors are feeling that contraction firsthand. Sermons that once inspired awe now compete with podcasts, documentaries, and lectures that offer deeper explanations without invoking the supernatural. And when your product is certainty in a world that rewards curiosity, the market for faith starts to collapse. So pastors leave not just because they're tired, but because they can see the writing on the wall. The institution they serve is slowly running out of answers. Attendance drops. Youth engagement fades. Donations decline. The stories that once unified communities now divide them. Religion is losing its monopoly on meaning. And when that happens, the people holding up the structure, the pastors, priests, ministers, begin to feel the weight of something that no longer supports itself. Some churches try to modernize, wrapping the same doctrines in trendy language, rebranding dogma as conversation. But under the surface, the same contradictions remain. The message doesn't fit the modern mind anymore. It promises certainty in an age that understands uncertainty is part of truth. Pastors, caught in that contradiction, become the casualties of an outdated system trying to survive in a world that's outgrown it. They're the canaries in the coal mine of belief, the first to suffocate when the air runs thin. And yet, there's something quietly hopeful in their departure. Because every time a pastor steps down, not from fatigue, but from honesty, it's a small act of truth, reclaiming its place from tradition. When enough people stop pretending, systems built on pretending start to crumble. And in that crumbling, there's room for something new, a morality not rooted in fear, but in empathy, a purpose not dictated by scripture, but discovered in reality itself. That new kind of purpose doesn't arrive all at once. It grows slowly, in the space left behind when certainty fades. Many former pastors talk about the strange calm that comes after the storm, the quiet realization that the world still moves, that meaning doesn't need a cosmic author to exist. They begin to see that life's value isn't diminished by its finiteness. In fact, it's deepened by it. When there's no eternity waiting, every moment starts to matter more. Every connection, every act of kindness, every decision carries more weight because it's all there is. That's something most of them never felt inside religion. In faith, meaning was always outsourced, handed down through holy books and doctrines, dependent on what someone else said reality should be. But outside, they discover ownership of meaning, the freedom to ask, to doubt, to change their minds without guilt. And it's that freedom, not rebellion, not bitterness, that defines the movement we're seeing now. When pastors leave, they're not simply abandoning faith, they're reclaiming the right to think freely. They're leaving systems that treat questions as threats, curiosity as weakness, and human complexity as sin. They're refusing to keep living double lives, one for the pulpit and one in private thought. That's why the numbers keep rising. What used to be isolated cases are now patterns. Younger generations of clergy are burning out faster, not because they're less committed, but because they're more self-aware. They were raised in a world where data, dialogue, and diversity are normal, so when they enter institutions built on absolute truth, the friction becomes unbearable. Older pastors describe it differently. They say it feels like standing in a museum of belief. The language, the rituals, the hierarchies, all preserved from another era, while the world outside evolves. They try to adapt, but the institution resists change because change threatens authority. So they end up performing faith for audiences that are slowly disappearing. And behind that performance lies a growing sense of irrelevance. Sermons that once felt powerful now echo into half-empty rooms. The applause feels mechanical. The prayers sound rehearsed. The same phrases repeated for decades. God is in control. Have faith. Trust His plan. Start to lose their power because they no longer connect with the questions people are actually asking. Questions about injustice, inequality, technology, existence, real issues that demand more than spiritual platitudes. People don't just want comfort anymore. They want coherence, and that's something religion can't consistently provide. So the pastors, the professional defenders of coherence, find themselves cornered. To keep their congregations, they have to simplify reality. But to stay intellectually honest, they have to complicate it. And those two demands can't coexist forever. Some leave quietly, slipping away without announcement. Others go public, writing books or speaking out about their loss of faith. Either way, the pattern is the same. The more they engage with truth, the further they drift from dogma. You can trace this historically. Every time knowledge expands, religion contracts. The Enlightenment shrank it. Modern science pushed it back further. Now, with information accessible to anyone, it's shrinking again not by force, but by exposure. The light of understanding doesn't destroy faith. It reveals that faith was never the source of light in the first place. And yet, even in decline, religion resists with remarkable resilience. Institutions built on belief don't collapse overnight. They adapt, rebrand, absorb criticism. But beneath that surface, the psychological toll grows. More pastors find themselves playing dual roles, public believers and private skeptics. They memorize the language of faith the way an actor memorizes lines. They perform sincerity because sincerity keeps the lights on. That kind of split living between truth and expectation slowly erodes the self. It's not just burnout, it's existential exhaustion. Pretending to believe for a paycheck is one thing. Pretending to believe because your entire social world depends on it is something much heavier. And that's the unspoken tragedy in all of this, that people who devoted their lives to truth end up trapped by lies they can't escape without losing everything. But it's also where change begins, because every person who finds the courage to step out chips away at the illusion that religion is eternal, necessary, or sacred. They're not enemies of faith. They're casualties of honesty. And honesty, in the end, is contagious. The more it spreads, the more others begin to question, not because they want to rebel, but because they want to understand. They want to know why so many of the people who knew the system best are walking away from it. When pastors leave, they don't just expose their own disillusionment. They reveal the cracks in the structure itself. The crisis of faith isn't a failure of individuals. It's a failure of the institution to evolve with reality. And reality always wins. Every generation that grows up with access to knowledge and critical thought pushes religion further to the margins. Pastors sense this, even if they never say it aloud. They see the decline in attendance, the loss of relevance, the fatigue in the eyes of believers who keep showing up out of habit, not conviction. And for those who truly care about truth, that realization becomes unbearable. They can't keep selling answers they no longer trust. They can't keep promising purpose in exchange for surrender. So they walk away, not because they've lost their moral compass, but because they finally found it outside the system that claim to own it. When they leave, most don't become cynics. They become seekers, but seekers of something far simpler and more real than divine narratives. They start looking for meaning in evidence, in empathy, in shared humanity. They learn to live with questions that don't have final answers, and that becomes enough. For years, they were told that doubt is dangerous, that questioning is a sign of weakness. But once they step outside, they realize that doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's the beginning of clarity. It's the mind's way of protecting itself from illusion. Many who leave describe how their emotional landscape changes. Fear fades. First, the constant anxiety about sin, judgment, and eternity begins to dissolve. Without the threat of divine surveillance, life feels lighter, not more meaningless, but more authentic. The small joys, the quiet mornings, the laughter of friends, all become sacred in a different way. Not because they're blessed, but because they exist. Then comes anger, not at people, but at the system that demanded silence and conformity. Anger at wasted years spent defending ideas that crumble under scrutiny. Anger at the guilt instilled from childhood guilt for being human, for thinking, for wanting to understand. But eventually, even that anger softens. They realize religion wasn't designed to harm them personally. It was designed to control uncertainty. It's just that control always comes at the cost of freedom. The most striking transformation happens when they start to rebuild not around belief, but around honesty. They find communities that don't demand agreement, only curiosity. They form connections based on compassion instead of creed. And for the first time, they see morality not as obedience, but as empathy in action. It's strange pastors who once preached about salvation discover a different kind of redemption, living truthfully, without fear. Meanwhile, inside the institution, leaders scramble to explain the exodus. Some blame culture, calling it a loss of moral fibre. Others point to technology, to secular education, to the lure of materialism. But the real cause isn't outside, it's inside. It's the institution's refusal to evolve, its insistence on answers that no longer match reality, its exploitation of faith for power and profit. Every generation inherits stories. The problem comes when stories are mistaken for truth. Religion could have survived as metaphor, a poetic language for human experience. But when it insists on being literal, it collapses under the weight of evidence. And pastors, the professional, interpreters of those stories, are the first to feel that collapse. They see what congregations don't, the statistics, the contradictions, the private confessions of believers who can't reconcile doctrine with life. They see prayers that go unanswered, suffering that gets moralized, people breaking under guilt that never belonged to them in the first place. They're the ones who watch the machinery up close and realize it's running on empty. It's not that people have stopped searching for meaning, they've just stopped buying it pre-packaged. And that's what makes this moment in history unique. For the first time, walking away from faith doesn't necessarily mean walking into despair. It means stepping into autonomy, intellectual, moral, emotional. People are realizing that being human is enough, that purpose doesn't have to come from above to be real. This shift doesn't just affect pastors, it affects entire generations of believers who grew up seeing faith as the default framework for life. The old assumption that belief is necessary for community, morality, or comfort is breaking down. Pastors can sense it, even if they never say it aloud from the pulpit. You can hear it in the new tone of sermons, softer, more defensive, more vague. The certainty is gone. The vocabulary is changing from truth to journey, from command to conversation. It's the language of a faith trying to survive its own evolution. But the more it softens, the less authority it holds. A belief system that once claimed to explain everything now explains almost nothing. And the people trained to uphold that system, the pastors, are realizing that maintaining illusion isn't the same as nurturing truth. That realization isn't just personal, it's cultural. It signals a broader awakening, a slow recognition that authority built on unverifiable claims can't sustain itself forever. The modern world doesn't destroy religion, it simply reveals its limits. And when those limits are exposed, those who depended on them for identity face a choice: double down on illusion or step into reality. More and more are choosing the latter. The process is painful, yes, but also necessary. Progress often begins where certainty ends. And that's what this wave of resignations really represents. Not the death of faith, but the evolution of integrity. The courage to say, "I don't know," instead of pretending to know. The strength to live without divine approval, guided only by conscience, compassion, and reason. In that sense, the departure of pastors isn't a crisis, it's a transformation. It's the human mind reclaiming its own authority after centuries of outsourcing it to invisible powers. For those who've left, the world outside belief isn't empty. It's full of complexity, uncertainty, and beauty unfiltered by dogma. They don't need sermons to tell them what matters anymore. They can see it for themselves in love freely given, in knowledge honestly earned, in life experienced fully, not filtered through guilt or fear. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind this whole story, that when the illusion of divine purpose falls away, what remains is still enough. They begin to realize that enough has been there all along, that existence itself, in all its imperfection and uncertainty, is already extraordinary without divine supervision. They see that awe doesn't belong to religion, it belongs to consciousness. You don't need a scripture to feel wonder at the night sky, or gratitude for being alive at all. For many former pastors, this realization is bittersweet. They grieve the loss of simplicity, the comfort of believing someone else had the answers. Faith once made the world feel small enough to understand, even if it was an illusion. Reality, by contrast, is vast and indifferent, but it's also honest. And that honesty becomes the foundation of a new kind of peace. They start noticing beauty in things they once overlooked, in uncertainty itself, in impermanence, in the simple fact that meaning isn't given, it's made. They begin to see morality as a living conversation, not a set of decrees. And in that freedom, some rediscover the very compassion they used to preach. But this time, without condition, outside the pulpit, life becomes quieter, but deeper. There's no longer the need to perform righteousness or defend impossible beliefs. They can simply live flawed, curious, kind. And that's often what surprises them most, that goodness feels lighter without the constant fear of divine judgment. For those who remain in the system, it's getting harder to ignore the exodus. The institution is losing credibility not because of outsiders attacking it, but because insiders are quietly walking away. Every pastor who leaves chips away at the illusion that belief is indispensable. Every resignation sends a message, not shouted, but whispered, that truth is worth more than belonging. The public rarely sees these moments. Churches still hold their services, sing their songs, collect their tithes, but beneath the surface, something fundamental is shifting. Congregations shrink, youth attendance drops. Doubt grows louder than prayer, and the sermons, once filled with conviction, now sound more like coping mechanisms. Some denominations try to rebrand out as faith-seeking understanding. But for many pastors, that's just a polite way of avoiding the real issue, that belief can't keep pace with reality anymore. The world no longer fits inside the theological box it built for itself. Climate change, AI, genetics, mental health, these aren't problems Scripture was designed to answer. The moral challenges of today aren't about ancient rituals or dietary laws. They're about empathy, sustainability, and shared responsibility. And for a religion obsessed with absolute truth, ambiguity is lethal. That's why the role of the pastor is becoming untenable. They're expected to be timeless guides in a world that evolves hourly. They're supposed to represent moral certainty in an era that values nuance, and that contradiction is eating the institution from within. You can see it in the rise of spiritual but not religious movements, people craving connection and meaning without control or hierarchy. In many ways, they're reclaiming what religion monopolized for centuries: the human desire to belong, to matter, to understand. Ironically, this shift could have been religion's chance to evolve to become symbolic rather than dogmatic, poetic rather than prescriptive. But most institutions resist that evolution because it means losing authority. It's easier to command belief than to inspire curiosity. So the cycle continues, faith hardens, doubt spreads, leaders burn out, and the system slowly empties from the inside. But the end of an era isn't necessarily tragedy. Every collapse makes room for something new, not another faith, but another way of being human. When people no longer look upward for meaning, they start looking outward toward one another. That's where former pastors often find their purpose again. Some become counselors, teachers, writers, advocates. They channel the same empathy that once filled their sermons into something grounded in reality. They no longer preach about love. They practice it quietly, without divine branding attached. And what's remarkable is how many say they've never felt more alive. They talk about rediscovering joy in uncertainty, community in honesty, and wonder in knowledge itself. One former minister described it perfectly: "I didn't lose faith, I lost illusion, and what's left is better." That's the paradox at the heart of this story. Religion claims to save people from despair, but for many, it's the cause of it. Once the weight of that belief system lifts, they find that life isn't meaningless after all, it's just finally theirs. The rise in pastoral resignations isn't just an occupational trend. It's a cultural pulse. It signals a collective fatigue with inherited certainty, with pretending to know what no one knows. It's a quiet revolution of integrity, people choosing honesty over tradition, clarity over comfort. And as more of them step away, something profound happens. The fear that kept belief alive begins to lose its grip. The idea that morality collapses without God starts to look absurd when you meet people living better, kinder, freer lives outside religion. The structure will keep standing for a while. Institutions always outlast belief. But the foundations are shifting, one mind at a time. Each pastor who walks away leaves a vacancy, not just in the pulpit, but in the illusion itself. And as that illusion thins, reality starts to show through. Maybe that's what progress really looks like. Not sudden revolutions, but small acts of truth, repeated until they become undeniable. It's happening quietly, but unmistakably. Across denominations, across generations, people who once built their lives on faith are learning to build them on truth. And in doing so, they're proving something religion never could: that meaning doesn't need eternity to matter. Because maybe, in the end, the most human thing of all isn't to worship, it's to wonder. And that's where this story settles, in the quiet aftermath of certainty, where those who once led congregations now lead lives defined by curiosity rather than conviction. The silence after the sermon isn't empty, it's spacious. For the first time, they can listen not for the voice of God, but for the subtle hum of being alive, unfiltered, unpromised, but real. Some still miss the rituals, the rhythm of Sundays, the feeling of purpose that came with being needed. It's hard to let go of something that shaped your entire identity. But the longing fades, and what replaces it is something sturdier, a grounded sense of belonging that doesn't depend on doctrine. They begin to realize that meaning built on illusion was never meaning at all, it was dependency. When they reconnect with the world, they find that compassion doesn't need theology to thrive. It only needs awareness. You don't need to believe in sin to recognize suffering, or invoke heaven to justify kindness. In fact, once the fear of divine punishment fades, empathy often becomes purer because it's chosen, not commanded. Some former pastors now dedicate their time to helping others deconstruct, guiding people through the same emotional wilderness they once wandered alone. They describe it like shedding layers of borrowed certainty, peeling back everything that once stood between them and the world. What's left isn't emptiness, it's clarity. The great irony is that many of them understand faith now better than ever, not as truth, but as a psychological structure built to manage fear. They've seen its architecture from the inside, the reinforcement loops, the social rewards, the guilt-based controls. And once you see the scaffolding, it's hard to pretend it's sky. Religion, for all its beauty and ritual, has always depended on one thing, the idea that we can't face existence without it. But these ex-pastors are living proof that we can, that we already are. Their departure isn't just a rejection of dogma, it's an affirmation of strength, the strength to face the unknown without disguising it as divine. This isn't about attacking belief, it's about understanding what it means to outgrow it. For centuries, society equated leaving religion with moral decay. But maybe it's the opposite, maybe it's moral evolution. Maybe it takes more integrity to admit uncertainty than to recite answers you no longer believe. And that's what so many of them have done quietly, courageously, without applause. They've chosen the harder path, the one without a map, without eternal guarantees. It's the same path humanity has always walked, long before temples and creeds, the path of self-awareness, of trying to make sense of existence from the ground up. When you listen to their stories, you hear echoes of an ancient shift from obedience to understanding, from superstition to knowledge, from control to curiosity. Every age has its heretics, but not all heretics burn. Some just walk away, lightened by truth. The exodus of pastors isn't a collapse of faith, it's a coming of age. Humanity is slowly realizing it doesn't need invisible authority to justify decency, purpose, or awe. The sacred isn't vanishing, it's just being redistributed into the real world where it always belonged. And maybe that's what this moment is trying to teach, that freedom isn't found in defiance alone, but in honesty. That letting go isn't loss, but growth. And that truth, though sometimes heavier, always carries more peace than illusion ever could. In the end, the story of pastors leaving the church isn't about crisis, it's about evolution. It's the natural consequence of a mind that refuses to stay caged once it's glimpsed the horizon. The same impulse that drove them to faith, the search for meaning, now drives them beyond it. And that's something deeply human, because the questions that make us doubt are the same questions that make us alive. And somewhere between certainty and silence, between the pulpit and the open air, those who've left are discovering something sacred after all. Not in heaven, but here, in the vast, fragile, fleeting fact of being.